Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberai, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. We are in week 49 of social distancing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the news today, President Biden will mark the 50 millionth vaccine shot in the United States today, while a House subcommittee continues hearings on the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Today's topic is combating climate change, and we are joined by Ken Berlin, the CEO of the Climate Reality Project. Ken, great to see you.
Great to see you, Ken. Thank you.
Well, how are you holding up? I mean, it's been 49 weeks. Every single time I kind of edit the notes before we start one of these, it's just like, this is, never ending. How have you personally been over the last 49 weeks? How's your team been? And how has your work at Climate Reality evolved during this time?
Great. Well, I've held up well. And as I said, I've got my 2 vaccine doses now. So I'm now ready to start resuming a more normal life. Obviously, COVID had a major impact on the Climate Reality Project, and let me start off by just giving you a brief description of the project. Climate Reality was founded by Al Gore, former Vice President, 2006, and he's still the chairman of our board. Our mission is to build public support for addressing climate change, and we do it in a couple of ways. We first train people to become what we call climate reality leaders. Before the COVID-19 crisis, we had been doing 3-day trainings of people. And in 2020, we had 5 trainings of about 1,500 people each scheduled. So of course, when COVID hit, we had to cancel all that and we had to start all over. And we had to figure out how to do virtual training, something we had never done. And we had a phenomenal response. Our first training that we did virtually, which ran for 9 days, about 2 hours a day. We had 14,000 applications to, an incredible number. So we really got a great response. And of course, it's going to change the way we do business going forward. And in those
1,500 to 14,000.
Yeah, now we did more than 150. We were going to do 1,500 trainings, but still, it's really an amazing difference. And in these trainings, we train people about climate change, about its solutions, its impacts, what they can do about it, how they can become leaders and organizers. Then after people are trained, we put them into a network we have. We have about 140 chapters in the United States, and we have 11 offices outside the United States. So we're a worldwide organization. And after training, our leaders go into those chapters, or they act on their own. They can do both. And of course, they had to switch, and we had to help them switch this year from doing in-person events and things like that to doing things virtually. And for example, we had a big campaign on voter registration, which we had to cancel in the spring. We figured out how to do it in the fall. We registered a very large number of voters, and we think that went very, very well. And the crisis really taught us and made us think in a couple of different ways. In addition to that, one is, of course, it highlighted the fact of how vulnerable we are as a society to these kinds of crises. We really ideally have to stop them in advance or as much as possible. And there are things we can do now to try and protect our society against these kind of pandemics. Then we have to be able to respond to it and be prepared to do that. And of course, climate change fits in that category. It's a potentially major crisis for people in the world. It's already a major crisis. It's not going to go away. Our goal is to keep it where it is and not let it get completely out of hand, because it's going to be bad. But we have to do that. So at a policy level, we think it enabled us to take a look at that. We also, of course, it had a profound effect on Black communities, Latinx communities, and poor communities, where the death rate was often twice as much as it is in other communities. Again, highlighting the need to address systemic inequalities in these communities, systemic racism, and again, we're making that part of our messaging going forward, and making it a central part of the work we're doing to try and address those issues.
And drill down a little bit on that, because I think just like the climate impact on communities of color, the disproportionate impact, the racial injustice about it all, I don't think gets enough attention, right? I mean, you're looking to expand, members of the communities for trainings, for advocacy. I mean, to scope this out a little bit of just like the magnitude, right? Because I think one of the things that COVID's clearly been an accelerant on so many things, but really kind of highlighting just the inequitable impact of the pandemic, but also highlighting just broader inequities that we're dealing with across, the country.
It absolutely does. First of all, if you live in a poor community, it's obviously much harder to deal with the crises when it takes place. If homes are destroyed by storms, if you have drought and food prices go up, if you have wildfires. So anybody in those situations has to deal with that. And one of the problems is that pollution has had a disproportionate impact on poorer communities and Black communities because we tended to put power plants and industrial facilities in those communities because they were the areas of least resistance when somebody wanted to build something. So we have major health impacts in Black communities, Latinx communities, and poor communities already from pollution. And climate change will just highlight that and make things much worse. So first of all, the disproportionate impact that's already occurred and will occur. We have to address that and figure out how to protect people. The second is that the transition we're going to have to make to address climate change to a clean energy economy is one that we want to make sure poor communities benefit from. Because what's going to happen is that wind and solar and batteries are going to get much cheaper than fossil fuel-based energy. And energy costs are a major burden on these communities. So we want to make sure that communities benefit from rooftop solar, community solar, battery power. And to do that, we've really got to make sure they can get the capital, make sure they can take the steps that they need to do that. So we're working first to address the disproportionate impact, then to make sure communities benefit from this, and then to also make sure they have the infrastructure they need and they have green infrastructure. Of course, again, infrastructure is a major problem there, and we will see major infrastructure legislation this year. And again, it just highlights the need to deal with systemic racism because ultimately the reason these communities are being hurt and the reason factories and power plants are built in these poor communities is because of the impact on racism and how it's helped keep these communities poor and made it difficult for people to lead healthy lives.
So on another end of that spectrum, staying on this topic, how do we increase equal access to opportunity for the jobs that are going to be created in a new clean energy economy, right? I mean, I feel like there's also going to be a disconnect in the access to opportunities, which, hopefully are going to be very rampant and prolific and expansive, and will kind of shape a generation of opportunities economically, right? How do we kind of bridge that gap as well, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that transition to clean energy economy is creating many, many millions of jobs. It's going to do it all over because one area is going to create jobs in energy efficiency, and you can have energy efficiency projects in every community.
Of course.
And then it's going to create jobs in installing wind and solar. They're among the fastest growing job categories in the country. And you've got to make sure, again, that the wind and solar can be installed in the first place. Otherwise, you won't have the jobs in those communities. You've got to make sure that those communities have the capital to do energy efficiency. Otherwise, you won't get the jobs in those communities. And we also have to make sure there's a really significant effort to transition communities that relied on fossil fuels to a new economic basis, because there are going to be a lot of jobs lost there. There's no question about that. We built our economy around coal, and the workers there deserve to be supported. And so, we think there's a need to really work very, very hard to make sure we bring jobs to those communities, whether it's reclaiming old coal mines, whether it's training workers to work on wind and solar projects, which they should be able to do very well, but again, making sure we bring the capital into those communities. So in my organization, many other organizations are looking both to figure out how to get jobs into poor communities, how to get jobs into communities that are being affected by the transition away from fossil fuels. We want to make sure there's a just and equitable transition, and that's what we're working on.
I feel like every season we keep hearing, this storm or this environmental issue was a once in 100 years, right? And it seems like every year we have a once in 100 year kind of situation, right? What's your take on what's been going on with whether it's wildfires, what happened in Texas last week with this dramatic freezing situation and the impact on communities there? These extreme weather events are not going away, are they? I mean, how does this all relate to climate? How are you using all these things that are happening in live time to kind of further expand access to the message you're promoting.
Yeah, I know. And, we're now being see once in 1,000-year storms on a regular basis, let alone once in 100-year storms. Look, the climate crisis creates an existential threat for all of us. Global warming is really both heating the environment, which leads to more moisture. It leads to bigger storms, more dangerous storms. It leads to things like wildfires because you also get major droughts out of this. It leads to droughts affecting farmers. It creates public health issues because of the spread of disease and tropical disease in a warmer temperature. And it really impacts in many ways almost every aspect of our society. And solving it is going to impact all aspects of our society because we're going to have to transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy, and that's going to have profound implications across the whole economic spectrum. So on the first level, these storms are very, very dangerous, and they're going to get worse. We have about 1 degree of heating right now, centigrade. And, if we don't take, the goal is to keep heating at 1.5 degrees centigrade. So even if we succeed, this is going to get worse. We just hope we can keep it under control. We could easily, though, go to 3 or 4 degrees centigrade and imagine we are at 1 degree now. What's going to happen if we triple the impact of this or quadruple the impact of what's happening on that? And what happened in Texas was, the one thing climate change does that's not necessarily intuitive is that aside from heating the environment, and we have less cold days, but because of the way warm air affects the airflow in the Arctic, we get what they're calling these polar vortexes. You get these freak storms coming down from the Arctic that can really bring severe cold and severe snow in various places, and that's what you saw in Texas. And Texas was totally unprepared for this. Now they had studies done that said they were unprepared for this kind of event, but they didn't spend the money to deal with it. They didn't spend the money to harden their systems. Wind and gas, whatever, they can work in any temperature. You just got to make sure you put the investment in to make sure they can do that. They didn't do it there. It's not clear they're going to do it even after this because, it requires a lot of funds. And if you think of it on a national basis, these impacts and the costs of addressing this are going to be extremely high. And, every 1/10 of a degree increase we have in climate change is going to make it worse. It's going to make it harder. It's going to make it more expensive. Last year, I think the estimate was that there were about $22 billion in damages from storms and weather, mostly strengthened by climate change and affected by climate change. So we face a real problem. And, again, and you saw in Texas that you're affecting everything. You're affecting heat, you're affecting water, you're affecting your ability to get gas, your supplies. I mean, this is really dangerous stuff. And, as we learned in COVID, we can't ignore these things.
So it seemed like a part of the response from some leaders in Texas was even to kind of push back against wind, to push back against kind of renewable energy, to kind of almost blame some of these transitions that are taking place for being the cause or the reason for some of the challenges that happen. I mean, how do you absorb, process, and respond to some of this?
The easy and stock answer to that is that's a total lie. I mean, first of all, the vast majority of energy lost in Texas was from gas-based plants, which froze, pipelines, which froze. There was some energy loss from wind also, but you have wind in North Dakota, South Dakota, the Yukon. It's all a question of having made the investment to make sure these things work. But the vast majority of problems came from the fossil fuel-based distribution system here. And in a more basic sense, it came from the fact that officials in Texas were unwilling to spend the funds they needed to harden their systems so that they could deal with this kind of cold weather. We have cold weather all over the country that's as bad as this and worse. And all these things keep operating there if you put in necessary investments.
So the science is almost universal, right? Like temperatures are going up, storms are happening more often. Why isn't there more of a collective kind of unified approach in responding to a climate crisis in our country?
Well, that's a very good question. And I guess the answer is that it's just become a political issue, not a science issue. And it's not become a political issue, not a fact-based issue. You can't argue with the science. You can't really argue with the facts. But we have a very strong group of climate deniers in this country that really have taken over most of the political party right now. And they've created a situation where they are opposing efforts to really deal with this crisis, despite the fact that you just can't read the news almost any day, without seeing it. I mean, Al Gore, for example, always says that reading a newspaper is like reading the Book of Revelations. It's just crisis after crisis, and of course, people are learning. I mean, the polls show now that 70% of the people want action on climate change. So we're getting there. And you've seen climate change in 2016 in the election, for example. Climate change was barely discussed. 2020, it became a major issue, and it's a major priority for the Biden administration. So people are learning on this, and I guess we're just going to have to beat back the deniers on that. I mean, in the end, what I think is going to happen is that renewable energy is going to be much cheaper than fossil fuel-based energy. It's become pretty ultimately. We're going to go to deniers and be able to say to them, look, you want your electricity, and I'm making up the number, 10 cents or 8 cents. Yeah. And I think that's going to be a powerful argument.
The market will drive it. Yeah. How has your advocacy, evolved over, the last 4 years in the previous administration? What were you, spending your time and energy on the advocacy side versus now with the new administration coming in that is obviously more aligned with some of the advocacy and work you're doing?
Well, the Trump administration was, openly hostile to climate change. It took many, many steps to weaken regulations and oppose any legislation. So what we had to do was two things. One is we concentrated on the state level. We worked with state officials and local officials, and we made a lot of progress there. I mean, 10 or 11 states for now, I think, have requirements that all of their electricity be 100% clean by a date certain, and that they have net zero emissions by 2050. There are more and more requirements for clean cars, and some states are beginning to say they're going to ban gasoline-driven cars by a certain date. So we made progress on the state level. Now we need to work on the federal level too, as I'll say in a minute. But we made progress, and what we tried to do was keep things going well enough so that we could catch up again, if we won this election, as we have. So we really looked at the state level on this, and then of course we continued our mission, which is to build public support for addressing climate change, by speaking, by reaching out, by doing social media. Our climate reality leaders did something like 7,000 presentations last year, by organizing meetings, by meeting with as many people as we could. And again, as I said, we're seeing the results of that and increased public support. Now that it's 2020, we have a new Senate administration dedicated to dealing with this. Still going to be very hard to pass legislation because everything is so closely divided, but we still expect that we're going to get major federal legislation passed, probably investment legislation and infrastructure bill, and funds to invest in renewable energy, which many Republicans support on that level. And as an organization, we're going to be switching from working at the state level to working at the federal level, and of course continuing to work at the international level.
Yeah. And so talk to me about the ecosystem of advocacy, right? You have new administration coming in. Michael Bloomberg is kind of leading the UN efforts on climate. John Kerry is now a new climate envoy. Bill Gates has a new book on issues of climate. United States is back in the Paris Accords. Where is this kind of global coordination? How does everybody fit into it? What is kind of, what should the steps be that we should collectively take as a planet, in your opinion? And how do all these kind of different actors play into it?
I mean, you mentioned a lot of very, very important advocates on this, and of course, I'd include Al Gore on that. Of course, who was a major, speaker around the world. I think that really what we're trying to do in the United States and everywhere in the world, as I said, is create this environment where politicians feel they have the public support they need to take these measures. And, redoing your economy, which you're really doing if you're transitioning from one source of energy to another, requires very strong public support. And our theory has always been that we are going to work with our activists so that they can go in and meet with their representatives to let them know that they want action on that, and they're going to support their action. And there are enough people around so they can feel able to do that. The people you mentioned, Gates, Bloomberg, Gore, are all, important part of that ecosystem also, because they're influential leaders who know the issues well and can be very, very convincing on that. And the business community is going to have a major influence on it, because the business community has taken many steps to address climate change. They support action on climate change. And as they let their representatives know that, that's another factor building into the equation, so that public officials realize that I think they all want to take this action. They realize they can take this action and be successful politically. And of course, it's a worldwide issue. That's why you need John Kerry going around and Bloomberg going around and Gore going around, because every country in the world has to take steps to reduce their emissions. They're doing that. Now, the United States has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. Trump took us out of it on November 4th, and we came back in a couple of days ago. So we were only out for a few months. But, we've lost a lot of our credibility around the world. We have to rebuild trust in the United States, in this and many, many other areas, in my view. And, one way we have to do it here is to make very, very strong commitments in the United States publicly to the Paris Climate Agreement to reduce our emissions. And the way the world works, we have this Paris Climate Agreement, which required every country in the world to make a commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and every country did. But those commitments weren't nearly enough. But the agreement recognized that and said every 5 years you've got to strengthen your commitment. This is the year where those new commitments are coming in. So the United States has to take the lead by making a very strong commitment on its own. Then it has to work with other countries in the world to do that. And it has to help, again, provide the capital, whether it's through private funding, public funding, lending, so that less developed countries can afford to make this transition.
So climate impacts everything: infrastructure, energy, jobs. One of the things that also impacts is public health, right? Are we going to put ourselves in a situation where more pandemics may emerge because of issues with environment, with ecosystem, climate, temperatures? How does all that play into potential for more pandemics in the future, for public health concerns? Tied that up, all right? I think this year, obviously, with the world dealing with the pandemic, everyone's acutely aware of how devastating that can be. And if climate change is going to have a greater impact on public health, how does that narrative get out there more to kind of some of the bigger challenges we're facing?
Well, there are two aspects of it. First of all, environmental destruction of forests and ecosystems has really brought human beings in closer contact with animals, the kind of animals that spread, that are really reservoirs of these viruses. Bats, for example, are reservoirs of these viruses. And what's happening is humans spread out and take over more and more land. They have more and more contact with these species that can spread a virus and lead to a pandemic. And as humans become more concentrated, these when it happens, when there's a spread to a human, it can spread very quickly in a concentrated urban environment. So we've got to sort of figure out how to disengage from that, how to give nature its space, and how to keep human beings out of that space as much as possible. Not eat the food, not get into the environment, and that's part of it. And of course, climate change again is affecting the environment everywhere. And the second way it's doing it is it's going to have major ecological consequences everywhere. It's going to cause all kinds of problems. It's going to cause species to move around because the environment is no longer suitable to them as it gets warm. And that just creates more and more opportunity for these kinds of interactions and these kind of catastrophes to occur. So again, environment is really, and climate change is really critical to trying to avoid these kind of crises. And of course, climate change, by warming the environment, raises the risk of spreading tropical diseases, of which there are many, up to the north, up to places like the United States. In general, diseases can spread more easily, in a warm environment like this.
Fascinating. So let's with our remaining time, I want to get your perspective on the role of the private sector in all this. From the real estate perspective, we're hearing a lot more from tenants who want buildings that are focused on ESG, on new technologies, on wellness. How does all of that play into it, right? I think there's more awareness now for consumers of actual office space and investors to actually hold landlords and buildings accountable for what's happening from a environmental standpoint. And that's just on the real estate side. I'd love your perspective kind of also on the Amazons of the world and larger companies taking a more proactive step on climate.
First of all, it's in the interest of American business to address climate change, and they recognize that. The transition we're going to make to clean energy is going to lead to cheaper energy down the line. And if we don't do that and other countries do, we'll become less competitive as we go along. Also, consumers are demanding it, as you just said. They want to see clean energy. And in fact, the evidence on the stock market shows that companies that have paid attention to environment and social governments and that actually are doing better financially than companies that haven't. The companies have had the incentive to do that. and they've been acting on it. American
Yeah.
big business played a really critical role in the last 4 years in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. There's something now called America is All In. It used to be America is Still In, which has almost 4,000 businesses, investors, and some national governments involved and committed to meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Companies like Amazon, these big internet companies, are sourcing all their energy now from clean energy, and they're actually building clean energy facilities to run their operations. So I think big business, is stepping up and taking its and doing its share of the work on this. Now, obviously, the fossil fuel industry is a more difficult question, and it's been harder for a lot of small businesses because, again,
Sure.
they'll benefit if they do these transitions, but again, it takes costs to do that, and they're stuck in ideological cross currents about what they should and should not do.
Yeah.
But in general, big business is doing what it should be doing on this, and as they become advocates, it obviously makes it much easier for public officials and leaders to support climate change, because with the business community behind them, their case is greatly strengthened.
Yeah, and I think I had done an event in New York years ago. I think it was with Business Forward, and we were highlighting kind of the food costs going up because of climate change and the impact on the restaurant industry and hospitality in general, and some of these things that important to be part of the broader dialogue, even for the small businesses and entrepreneurs and restaurants and so on. When you think about your food,
right? And obviously, climate change has a huge impact on farmers and droughts and having to switch crops and all that. And I think the agricultural community is recognizing, farmers are recognizing that more and more, as we go along. I mean, they know that they're being affected by climate change. There was an argument for a while. Well, it's sort of, a cycle. It's not anything, that we can do anything about. But in fact, the evidence shows clearly it's not a cycle. And eventually, farmers, and they're beginning to say that now. Do I want to try and save my business, or I just want to sit there on my hands and do nothing?
Yeah. So before I let you go, last question. Talk to us about the importance of young people and kind of continuing to heighten the conversation, both for policymakers and for business leaders, right? I mean, I think a lot of businesses are reacting because a younger generation is more acutely aware. And I think some of the metrics you highlighted about the percentages of folks paying more attention to climate directly tied to younger people being more active.
Well, young people and people in communities of color, particularly young people in those communities, have really led the way the last year, and in demonstrating and in speaking to officials and doing social media in the United States, and voting in much larger numbers than ever in the presidential election. I mean, they've been leaders on this, and so organizations like Climate Reality are, of course, trying to work with them, to appeal to them, to help train them, because that's part of the job we do on this, and to work with social media on them. So we're very, very excited about this inspiration we're getting from young people. And to some extent, they've really pushed the policy agenda too. Things like the Green New Deal, which, the Green New Deal is really a combination of two things: a combination of aggressive climate change proposals, and also proposals to deal with other issues that really affect us all, healthcare and all that. Some degrees was a political platform, is one way to look at it. And you don't have to call it the Green New Deal, but this new administration is working on strengthening all of its environmental commitments, and it's looking to address a lot of the issues that were addressed in the Green New Deal of healthcare, systemic racism. They're going to be working on a lot of the kind of issues that were raised in that. It's become a bogey word to people, but in reality, it's a strong environmental program that's designed to help deal with the parts of the economy that create inequality and racism.
That's amazing. Well, look, Ken Berlin, thank you to your team, all the work. It's always great to see you. Congrats on your vaccines, and look forward to seeing you out there in person. Appreciate everyone tuning in today. Our next Coffee with Ken is going to be next week with Stephanie Shirok from Emily's List. In the meantime, please practice social distancing, wash your hands, and wear a mask. Ken, good to see you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Ken. And thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye, folks.